the motorcade comes down Main Street. It's going to take a right on Houston so it can make a left on Elm. And the reason why they are going left on Elm is because when they get through that triple underpass, you can see in the picture, they're going to take a freeway entrance to Stemmons Freeway, which we'll talk about, which is going to take him directly to the Trade Mart, where he's supposed to speak at a luncheon speech. Now, why didn't he just go straight down Main? Why didn't he go down Main, and why did he make that turn on Houston and that turn on Elm to get on the interstate? Why did he just go down Main? Straight, nice and straight, no problems. Anybody know? Well, if you get on the other side, and I'll show you a picture of the triple underpass, they have large cement abutments, so to speak, because Main Street doesn't take you to the interstate. Okay, it's a straight line, and then Commerce is straight, and then Elm is straight. Once you get a certain distance down Main, you could have, turned and got on the interstate, but what would you have to done to do that? Run over those concrete abutments, and that's not very presidential. I mean, they weren't going to do that. So a lot of conspiracy theorists say, well, no, they should have just gone down Main Street. He wouldn't have had to make that turn, and it would have been no problems. He couldn't do that because you couldn't get on the interstate. Does that make sense? So that just kind of throws that out. Okay, well, when the motorcade reached Houston Street and took the right, they were heading right towards a building called the Texas School Book Depository. Right towards the building. And if you look at your sheet here, you can see it very clearly. It's this building that has the Hertz car sign on top of it. That is the Texas School Book Depository building. Now, what was the Texas School Book Depository? It was a huge warehouse that supplied textbooks to schools all across the South. So if you were a school in the South, you would order your textbooks, your history books, your math books, your science books, whatever, from the Texas School Book Depository. People worked there, they filled the orders and sent them out. That's what it was. Well, at 12:29 p.m., after traveling on Houston Street for a short distance, the presidential limousine passed right in front of the Dallas County Courthouse. And that's that big red building in your picture. So at 12:29, after traveling on Houston Street for a short distance, and they're still traveling on Houston Street, about to take the turn on Elm, the presidential limousine itself passes right in front of the Dallas County Courthouse. At that point, Nellie Connolly, Mrs. Connolly, the governor's wife, turns to President Kennedy and says, quote, "Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." So they're just getting ready to make the turn on Elm. They're on Houston. They're passing right in front of the Dallas County Courthouse, and Mrs. Connolly turns to the president and says, "Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." What does she mean by that? You can't, Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you. Why did she say that in the first place? What's that? Yeah, everything was going good because there was the question of how Dallas would react to the president's visit because they were so much against his policies. And she was thrilled that everything had gone very well, and she turns to the president and says, "Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." Kind of an interesting, ironic thing. Well, they finished the short distance down Houston Street, and the presidential motorcade makes a sharp left turn onto Elm Street. And we kind of explained that in your picture. And again, the reason they turned on Elm Street is because it's going to be much more convenient to catch the Stemmons Freeway exit, which would take the president to the Dallas Trade Mart for his luncheon speech. So the motorcade makes a sharp 120-degree turn onto Elm Street, which slowed the presidential limousine down to about 11 miles an hour. Well, that wasn't any more dangerous than slowing down the presidential limousine to 0 miles an hour when he stopped to greet the school kids and the nuns. So a lot of conspiracy theorists say, oh yeah, that was all planned, so they slowed that motorcade down so, they'd be right in the target hairs of the assassin. So you hear all kinds of things. Well, this is kind of an interesting term. because after the sharp 120-degree turn onto Elm Street, which slowed the presidential limousine down to approximately 11 miles per hour, the motorcade continues down Elm Street towards a grassy incline to the right of Elm Street, now known as the famous grassy knoll. And again, if you have your picture out in front of you, this area right in here where this monument type thing is, that went down in history right here as the grassy knoll. And we'll tell you where it got its name, etc. later. But that's what people are talking about if you've ever heard of the grassy knoll. Well, that's going to take us to our next subtopic, which is 3 shots in Dealey Plaza. 3 shots at Dealey Plaza. So you can picture where the presidential limousine is. It's traveling down Elm Street towards the Stemmons Freeway exit. It's kind of right in the middle here, kiddos. If you look at this map again, it's going to be kind of right across right here from this area where we know the grassy knoll. Okay, kind of about where that light is there. Okay, so it's right at the end of this 11-mile motorcade, and all of a sudden at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, 3 shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. These 3 shots that would be fired at President Kennedy's limousine would change the course of American history forever. Now, I'm going to give you the facts of the shots according to history, the order of the 3 shots fired on November 22nd, 1963 in Dealey Plaza. Okay, and we can argue the shots, and I can tell you my philosophy later. The first shot was fired from above, here's the president, above and to the right of the president. Above and to the right. The first shot was fired from above and to the right of President Kennedy's limousine. Above and to the right. In the vicinity of what? Texas School Depository. Now picture this and write it down. The first bullet first entered President Kennedy's back, traveling at a downward angle. So it hit him in the back. It exited out his throat. And when that bullet exited out his throat, he immediately put both hands to his throat, just like this, which you will see clearly in a film I'm going to show you later. But if you look at this black and white handout that I gave you today, where is that thing? And I circled it, you can see Kennedy's left hand. He's got his shirt, which is white, and the blue is his sleeve of his sport coat. If you look in that circle, that thing that looks kind of lighter, kind of flesh-colored, is his hand. You can see his head looking down. The white part of that to the left is his shirt sleeve, and to the left of that, that dark color, is his sport coat. The bullet hits him in the back, exits out his neck. You can see in the film I'll show you, both hands come straight up to his neck, without question. Well, the bullet then continues and hits Governor Connolly in the back at the rear of his right armpit. Hits him in the back at the rear of his right armpit. So the bullet hits Kennedy in the back, exits out his throat, goes through Kennedy and hits Connolly in the back in the area of his right armpit. The bullet continues through Governor Connolly's body and shatters his 5th rib and exits out the right side of his chest. So it hits him in the back, exits out the right side of his chest, and during that momentum of the bullet, it shatters his 5th rib inside. So the bullet hits Kennedy in the back, exits out his throat. The president clearly brings both hands to his throat when he's hit. The bullet continues through Kennedy, hits Connolly in the back, exits out the right side of his chest and shatters his 5th rib en route. The bullet then exits Connolly's chest, hits his right wrist, and shatters the radius bone. Bullet goes through Connolly's body, hits him in the right wrist, and shatters his radius bone, eventually deflecting off his right wrist, where they find the bullet in his left thigh. So shot number 1, from up above and to the president's right, hits President Kennedy in the back, exits through his throat. Clearly, he's hit, got both hands up to his throat. Bullet exits President Kennedy's throat, hits Connolly in the back, below the right armpit, continues through Connolly, exits out the right side of his chest, in the meantime, shattering his 5th rib, exits Connolly's body, hits him in the right wrist, shattering his radius bone, and then buries itself in his left thigh. Shot number 1. The second shot misses the presidential limousine. It goes over the top of the vehicle, and it hits a cement curb in front of the triple underpass. So if you look at your map here, you can see this center abutment that's kind of holding the triple underpass up. It hits the cement right below that, and there's a fellow by the name of James Tagg that's standing there. He's a Dallas car salesman who simply came down to Dealey Plaza to see the presidential parade. He is standing right next to that bridge abutment that I talked about, and he feels a sting on his cheek because he is nicked in the face by either a fragment of the cement that came up from the bullet or possibly a bullet fragment. How do we know that? He reaches up to his cheek and feels blood on his cheek, a small amount of blood. So the second shot misses the presidential limousine, goes over the top, hits the cement curb. James Tagg is standing looking up at the Texas School Book Depository, looking at the president coming at him, and he feels a sting on his cheek, and he reaches up and feels blood, either hit by a fragment of cement or a bullet fragment. The third and final shot hit President Kennedy directly in the back of the head. Blood and brains flying in all directions. He's hit right in the back of the head. One of the most brutal sights you'll see, and we'll give you a chance to see it. Blood and brains everywhere. Remember Patrolman Bobby Hargis, who was one of the police officers on motorcycles? He had only been with the Dallas police force for a week. He was splattered with brain matter and blood from the president's wound as the final fatal shot hit the president in the head. Remember Patrolman James Chaney, who was also one of the patrolmen on motorcycles next to the limousine? He was less than 6 feet from the president, and he was later quoted as saying, his head exploded in blood. And you'll see this, you won't believe it. Now, after witnessing the third and fatal shot, and this is a very rare signature, Bill and Gail Newman fall to the ground protecting their 2 children as they are standing right on the curb. I would guess 6 or 7 or 8 feet from the president when he was hit. So also witnessing the fatal third shot were Bill and Gail Newman. They were both 22 years old. They were with their 2 young boys. They were standing on the curb on the north side of Elm Street when they became witnesses to one of the most horrific events in American history. Immediately after the third shot, the Newmans fell to the ground, shielding their children. They are probably the most recognizable eyewitnesses to the shooting, as they appear in almost all of the iconic photos of the event or any videos that were taken. You can see them laying on the ground, and you'll see them many times. Actually, you've probably seen them in videos that we've already done and didn't know who they were. So also witnessing this fatal third shot were Bill and Gail Newman. They were both 22 years old at the time. They had their 2 young boys with them. They were standing on the curb on the north side of Elm Street when they became witness to one of the most horrific events in American history. Immediately after the third shot, the Newmans fell to the ground, shielding their children. They are among the most recognizable eyewitnesses to the shooting, as they appear in many of the iconic photos taken during this tragic time in American history. Now, after the third shot, two things of significance happened. After the third shot, first thing that happened, Agent Hill, who was in the Secret Service limousine right behind the presidential limousine, turned to the rest of the Secret Service and gave the thumbs down, letting them know that the third shot was really bad in view of life concerning President Kennedy. He saw the third shot, and as soon as he saw it, he turned to the rest of the Secret Service agents in that car and gave him a thumbs down, like that was a fatal shot. Another thing that was really interesting, kind of sad, a little bit gross, is after the third shot, Jackie began to climb out the back of the limousine towards Clint Hill, who was racing now to try to get onto the limousine to protect Mrs. Kennedy. And he stepped several times, almost falling down, and if he would have fell down, he'd have been run over by, obviously, the Secret Service vehicle. Well, Mrs. Kennedy had climbed on the top of the limousine. Does anybody know why? To get a piece of his skull that had flown off. She kind of had lost it for a minute, and she was climbing on the back of the limousine to retrieve a piece of the president's skull that had been blown off of his head. Well, as I mentioned, she was met by Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had leaped onto the back of the car, pushing her back down in the car, and Hill nearly fell from the limousine several times, and you'll see this, and certainly would have been run over by the Secret Service vehicle that was closely following the president if he would have. Well, basically what Hill does from that point is he provides a human shield for the Kennedys as the limousine began a race to nearby Parkland Hospital, which was 77 blocks away, about 4.6 miles. Okay? So as Mrs. Kennedy is on the back of the limousine reaching for a piece of her husband's skull that had been blown off in the fatal third shot, Clint Hill is racing to the limousine, almost falling several times to try to get on to push Mrs. Kennedy back down into the car. Once he gets on top of the car safely and gets her back down into the seat, he provides a human shield for the Kennedys as the limousine began to race to nearby Parkland Hospital, which was 77 blocks away, or about 4.6 miles. I'm going to give you lots of quotes here. You don't have to write them down. Mrs. Kennedy was later quoted as saying this: "I heard these terrible noises, and my husband never made a sound. He had this sort of quizzical look on his face. I remember thinking he just looked as if he had a slight headache. I remember falling on him and saying, 'Oh my God, they have shot my husband. And I love you, Jack.' I remember I was shouting." The quizzical look on his face was after the third shot, or excuse me, the first shot, when he brought his hands up, and you'll see he kind of turns and looks at her like, whoa. And that's the quizzical look she was talking about, and then all of a sudden she faces the absolute worst. Clint Hill was later quoted as saying, "I heard a noise. I saw President Kennedy grab at himself and lurch forward." That would have been the first shot. "Mrs. Kennedy jumped from the seat. When she noticed that I was trying to climb on the car, she turned toward me and I grabbed her and put her back in the back seat and lay there." Governor Conley, also hit in the shooting, who survives, was later quoted as saying, "Strangely, I had but one thought. This is an assassination attempt. When I was hit, I said, 'Oh, no, no, no.' And then I said, 'My God, they're going to kill us all.'" Kennedy aide Kenneth O'Donnell, who you've heard a lot about, who was traveling in the Secret Service car immediately behind the presidential limousine, later wrote, "After the second shot, David Powers said to me, 'Kenny, I think the president's been shot.' I made a quick sign of the cross. We both stared at the president. A third shot took the side of his head off. We saw pieces of bone and brain tissue and bits of reddish hair flying through the air. The impact lifted him and shook him limply as if he were a rag doll. And then he dropped out of our sight, sprawled across the back of the car. That was what Kenneth O'Donnell wrote later. Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood, who was assigned to President Johnson, was later quoted as saying, "I turned instinctively in my seat, and with my left hand I grasped Lyndon Johnson's right shoulder, and with all the leverage I could exert from a sitting position, I forced him downward. 'Get down,' I shouted, 'get down.' The Vice President reacted immediately. Still not seeing the source of the explosion, I swung across the back seat and sat on top of him," because he was in the car protecting the Vice President. Also present on Elm Street at the time of the shooting was Mary Ann Mormon and her friend Jean Hill. They were famously known, Jean Hill was famously known as the Lady in Red, and I'll show you why in a minute. So also present on Elm Street at the time of the shooting was Mary Ann Mormon and her friend Jean Hill, now famously known as the Lady in Red. Now these two ladies were standing across Elm Street on the opposite side of the grassy knoll. So if you look at Macklin's picture here, they were standing in the vicinity right here, right across the street. Not on the grassy knoll side, but right across the street. And you will see them clearly in this film I'm going to show you. Now, Mormon and Hill really weren't in Dealey Plaza not so much to see President Kennedy, but they were there to see the First Lady, Jackie. That's what interested them. And Mormon had her Polaroid camera, which looked identical to this. Identical. This is the